All right, let's dive right in. We're going to do a deep forensic investigation into something truly terrifying that's been happening over and over again. These deadly fires sweeping through India's hospitals. Take a look at this number, 120. And that's just the reported deaths in major hospital fires in just over 2 years. I mean, let that sink in. This isn't just a series of random, tragic accidents. No, what we're seeing is a symptom of a much deeper systemic crisis. And what's really crucial to understand is that the kind of fires we're seeing has completely changed. You know, before the pandemic, you might see a fire in a hospital kitchen or a storage area. Bad, but often containable. Now, these fires are starting in the absolute worst places imaginable, ICUs and neonatal units. We're talking about places where patients are completely helpless, often on life support. Escape for them is, well, it's pretty much impossible. Okay, so let's get into the incident reports. When you start to look at the data, where these fires are happening, how often, a really chilling pattern starts to emerge. The data is just stark. Get this. Almost 60% of these deadly fires start in ICUs or other critical care units. Think about that. We're not talking about hallways or waiting rooms. We're talking about the very heart of the hospital's life support system. It's supposed to be the safest place, but it's become the epicenter of the danger. And you might think, oh, this is probably a problem in underfunded government hospitals. But look at this. Nearly 3/4, 74% of these disasters happen in private hospitals. That just completely shatters the idea that more money automatically means more safety. It's clearly not that simple. So the big question is why? Why are ICUs suddenly these incendiary zones? Well, it's not just bad luck. It's actually predictable, deadly chemistry. We call it the ICU fire triangle. And the whole thing really kicks off with this one concept, an oxygen-enriched atmosphere, or OEA. Honestly, this is the single most critical ingredient that turns a tiny spark into an absolute inferno in seconds. So the air you and I are breathing right now, it's about 21% oxygen, standard stuff. But in an ICU, with all the ventilators and high-flow oxygen therapy, it's really easy for small leaks to happen. And that oxygen level can just creep up, and the margin for safety is terrifyingly thin. Once you get just above 23.5% oxygen, you've entered a dangerously high-risk zone. And here's the kicker. Just a 3% increase in oxygen, something you wouldn't even notice, can literally double the burning rate of everyday things, like bed sheets, curtains, even a doctor's uniform. Stuff that's normally considered flame retardant can suddenly catch fire like it's gasoline-soaked. Okay, so that's the oxygen. Now for the first side of our deadly triangle, the fuel. And believe me, a modern ICU is just loaded with it. Those PPE kits, they're made of polypropylene, which is basically solid petroleum. The hand sanitizers, they're over 70% alcohol. When the plastic bottles melt, you've got pools of liquid fuel. And the foam mattresses, wow, they don't just burn, they release toxic cyanide gas. All right, so we've got the oxygen and the fuel. What's the spark? Well, in something like 80% of these fires, the ignition source is a totally predictable electrical failure. It's the silent killer. Think about air conditioners running 24/7, overheating, or a loose wire somewhere just silently building up heat. Even the modern medical gear can create this thing called harmonic distortion, which overheats wires from the inside out. In an oxygen-rich environment, even a tiny spark of static electricity from a blanket can be enough to start the whole nightmare. So you've got these three things: oxygen, fuel, and a spark. Individually, they're dangerous, but put them together inside a healthcare system that's been pushed way, way beyond its limits, and you have a perfect storm. And really, this is a legacy of the pandemic surge that's just kind of become the new dangerous normal. I mean, just think about it. You've got electrical panels designed for 20 beds that are now trying to power 40. That's a recipe for what's called thermal runaway. They just silently overheat. Then you've got makeshift ICUs in converted hallways that don't have the right ventilation, so all that leaking oxygen just pools in dangerous pockets. And on top of all that, you have high-pressure oxygen lines and illegally stored cylinders that act like rocket fuel. It is literally a perfect storm for a fire. Okay, so now let's look at some specific tragic cases, because this is where you really see how that perfect storm, combined with a complete and utter failure to follow basic safety rules, leads directly to people dying. Look at this timeline of negligence. In Bhandara, 10 babies died from suffocation because the smoke wasn't properly contained. In Ahmednagar, 11 people died after a fire where sprinklers had been recommended, but were never actually installed. Every single one of these tragedies is a case study, a story of a specific documented safety rule just being completely ignored. Here's a great example. There's a rule in the National Building Code. It's a simple, life-saving rule. It says hospital corridors have to be at least 2.4 meters wide. Why? So you can actually move patients out on their beds during an emergency. This isn't just a nice-to-have suggestion, it's the bare minimum required to get helpless people out. But then you look at the Jhansi hospital fire. What did investigators find? 55 infants crammed into a neonatal unit that was designed for only 18. When you have that level of overcrowding, that 2.4-meter rule might as well not exist. It becomes meaningless. The ward itself turns into a death trap because there's simply no way to get anyone out. And this is the devastating result of all that. In some state audits, they found that up to 90% of smaller hospitals were operating without a valid fire no objection certificate. That's the basic piece of paper that says, hey, we've met the minimum fire safety standards. It's a compliance catastrophe on an absolutely massive scale. But here's the thing. This isn't some unsolvable mystery. We know the physics. We know where the failures are. And that means this whole crisis is preventable. So let's talk about the solution. What's the actionable blueprint that hospitals could start using, like, tomorrow? And we're not talking about some expensive, high-tech fantasy. This is just basic, common-sense stuff. We're talking about simple engineering and administrative discipline. Things like using infrared cameras to find those electrical hotspots before they ignite, running realistic evacuation drills, and I mean for bedridden patients, not just staff who can walk out, mandating regular oxygen audits to check for leaks, and just enforcing a zero-tolerance policy for cluttering up the hallways. These 4 things, they could save countless lives. So if you take away one thing from all this, let it be this. These fires are not random acts of God. They are predictable and they are preventable. What we're dealing with is a brand new kind of disaster, an oxygen electrical fire. It's born from that deadly triangle of excess oxygen, flammable modern materials, and overloaded electrics. And the whole thing thrives in this massive gap between what the safety rules say on paper and what's actually happening on the ground. Which really leaves us with one final, crucial question. It's all about priorities, isn't it? We have to start treating fire safety with the exact same clinical, life-or-death seriousness that we treat infection control. A loose wire has to be seen as being just as deadly as a contaminated needle, because until we make that mental shift,